Hello and welcome to the after party. I'm No White Guilt, and with me is the Great Order. To watch the show and to watch any of my content in Europe, please change your location on YouTube to the United States or use a VPN. Typically, the way this works is that while we are live streaming, you will be able to see the stream wherever you are around the world, but after the stream has transitioned to a video on the channel, the European governments, one at a time, began making the video unavailable to their populations because they cannot stand their populations going free. Appearing on the honors roll call today is Albertus, Andrews B and C, Dainty Brighton, our very own, David's L, P, and S. Our very own Elaine Sabatino, Fiona, Inquipper, a guy with a great name, Jason, J's, B, and P, Jeffrey, Johns, N, M, and G, Johnny, M, N, and J, Judson, Lawrence, the great Luke, and Omar. These good souls invest monthly in white well-being, and by so doing demonstrate the heroic spirit of our people. I treasure every single one of you. As for the Super Chat crown winner of last week, the crown goes to Roy Danton the Great for investing a total of 105, if it isn't white, it isn't right, dollars. Cheers and gladness to you, good sir. In second place was Alt Fit, investing 20 pounds, a dozen thanks to you as well, my friend. And I also want to mention a $6 super chat we missed last week by DB Cooper. Thank you, sir, for that kind investment in white well-being. Jared and I are deeply grateful for all of your investment in us and the cause of white well-being. Super chat on YouTube at 33%, on Entropy at 15%, where you can also watch the stream, ask and vote on questions, participate in polls I post, or follow the rabbit down into the video's description for a familiar alternative at 4%. Jared and I evenly share the super chats with our guests here on our marquee show, The After Party. Today, we're getting tapped into Dr. Ricardo Duchesne. Duchesne is a former professor from the University of New Brunswick, where he taught for 24 years until his decision to take early retirement this summer. He is the author of 3 books: The Uniqueness of Western Civilization, Faustian Man in a Multicultural Age, and Canada in Decay, Mass Immigration, Diversity, and the Ethnocide of Euro-Canadians. Canada in Decay has been a bestseller at Amazon.ca since it was published in August 2017. Duchesne's critical reflections on the imposition of immigrant diversity upon Canadians triggered many academics across Canada, imagine that, leading to academic mobbing attack against his employer at UNB. Duchesne used to be a typical leftist academic until he realized in the late 1990s that leftists are inherently incapable of appreciating the high cultural achievements of the West in their determination to bring about cultural and sexual equality. He is currently writing a book arguing that Europeans were the first and possibly the only humans to become conscious of their consciousness and thus to learn how to think rationally and freely about the nature of things. Now, recently, Ricardo published an article in the on the blog of Council of European Canadians, and I want to just briefly read to set the tone for this totality of this interview, because it is absolutely magnificent. And I want to touch upon this before we get rolling. He writes here in this article, our focus should be on the aristocratic male culture of ancient Greece and its promotion of ego consciousness. Brilliantly, he goes on, the Indo-Europeans and the heroic Homeric Greeks intensified the consciousness of the male ego, inventing the patriarchal rule of Olympus, the supremacy of sky gods in opposition to the original cult of demonic and inherently unconscious fertility goddesses, which had hitherto ruled all societies, and from which non-European males never managed to detach themselves in the same degree as Indo-European males. We will examine in a future article how the more intense masculinization process associated with the Indo-European pastoral, horse-riding, aristocratic way of life started the emancipation of ego consciousness from the enveloping world of the Great Mother, in which humans were ruled by the irrationality of chance, demons, and witches, entrapped to a world of Chthonian darkness, embedded to nature, the emotional impulses of the body, orgiastic frenzies, and hallucinations. Brilliantly said. It is a deep honor to both Jared and myself to welcome Dr. Ricardo Duchesne to the after party. Please, Jared, do the honors.
It is indeed a great honor. Ricardo, I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and anyone that knows me knows that your work has influenced me tremendously. So I thank you, and I look forward to a terrific conversation today. Before we get into the interview proper, I'll just let you introduce yourself to our audience for a moment. And if you want to say anything about being in academia, as Jason was mentioning in your bio, and what that was like, what you had to deal with, I'll give you the floor, and then we'll get into our conversation. But welcome to the after party.
Hello, Jared. I'm glad to be here and having a conversation with you on your channel. Yes, I was, as I was just introduced, I was an academic or a professor hired at a Canadian university, the University of New Brunswick, which is in Canada, in the province of New Brunswick. And I taught there for about 24 years until I decided to take early retirement this summer. In regards to my experience in academia, when I started, I was a typical leftist. Although from the very beginning, I had a certain disappointment. I felt that academics were too specialized. This was a complaint I had since I was a student. I wanted to deal with the big questions, read the big books, and address huge topics like Western civilization, the origins of agriculture, the origins of civilization. And there was no room for that. I was told that I needed to really specialize in a very narrow topic. Luckily, I found a program at the University of York, or York University. And in that program, there was an interdisciplinary focus that allowed you to do multiple disciplines. You did not have to specialize in a sociological field or historical or philosophical. You could do philosophy courses, economics, sociology. So that's what I did. And that allowed me to address big issues. And then I went into academia, but I felt that there wasn't really that many people that you could talk to. So overall, it was a good job. You get a good salary, but my experience was not a very good one intellectually speaking. The people that I found interesting in an intellectual sense tended to be outside academia. When I was into midway through my employment there is when I began to move away from the left. And one of the reasons as was just stated, is that I felt that the left really had this animosity against Western civilization. And that was something that to me meant that you don't value that which is highest. And I believe that a place that calls itself a place of higher learning has to mean as well a place that cares about the high things in life, the high cultural things that have been achieved by human beings. And Western civilization to me embodied that which was highest. So that was one of the big disappointments I had, that sense that I couldn't address big issues and that leftist academics had no regard for Western civilization.
Yeah, and you do a terrific job in your books of exposing that whole leftist paradigm that you have to deal with and taking down some of those narratives. I certainly recommend, as I often do, that our listeners get your books, and we'll have all your contact information in the description of the video. Now, you'll see, the audience will see that Jason and I titled this show Weaving White Paradoxes. And Dr. Duchesne, his knowledge is deep and it's also broad. So we were thinking of the ways that we can really frame this conversation so that we can get as much as we can out of this time talking to him and present as much to you and be useful in the time that we have. So what we decided to do, we decided to take a bit of a different approach, and all of our questions are going to center around a dichotomy. And these dichotomies we'll ask Dr. Duchesne about his clarification around these dichotomies, or how European peoples need to better synthesize and harmonize these dichotomies, these different twin instincts within us, to better respond to the crisis of the modern age and what we're dealing with right now. So, Ricardo, the first thing I'd like to speak to you about and get your thoughts on is this word modernity, because it's invoked both positively and negatively, depending on the context. Positively, we might hear people cite increased wealth over the last century or so, and especially the last few centuries, but very much focusing on the last century, a lot of people do. Hygiene, technology, comfort. On the negative side, you might hear people talk about atomization, increased meaninglessness, and of course, the whole corporate globalism. So I'd like to break that down and get into that a little bit, hear your thoughts on that dichotomy, couching modernity in positive and negative terms, and specifically, of course, locating white peoples in that, in both the development of modernity and its effects, and how we can navigate where we are now in 2019.
Right, and modernity is a big, big topic, and I'm aware that there are traditionalists on our side that criticize the West because they see the West as the main promoter of modernization across the world, the promoter of what they perceive to be a homogenization of cultures, every culture imitating the West, and they don't like that. Alan de Benoist, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but there are others, and Alexander Dugin as well. They're very critical, Dugin in particular, of the history of Western civilization. It's not just modernity in recent times, but in their attempt to understand the origins of this modernization process, they go back to Christianity and they point to many developments in Western history, and they look down upon those developments that are associated with capitalism, industrialization, what they call massification, excessive individualism, and consumerism. So they target these traits that are identified with the West, and they give a kind of negative take on Western civilization. Whereas in my case, I have always admired Western civilization, but at the same time, I came from a West or a leftist side And that leftist side did teach me quite a bit about the problems with modernization. So I'm aware of all those issues, the meaninglessness of life and so on. But in terms of the history of the West, and it does involve individualism, it involves increasing use of science in industry, it involves democratization, equalization. And I tend to look at these developments in a more positive way. I don't see them in such a negative way as Dugin does. And I also don't see traditionalism in the same positive way in which they see it, even though there are many values that to me have a permanence to them, many moral things that I think hold true across a long period of time. And if they're being challenged, for example, right now we see this whole effort to dilute and break apart the sexual differences between men and women. So if you think this is something that is being driven by the West and the roots of which lie back in Western history, then you're going to think there's something negative about the West. Whereas I first don't think that this dissolution of the sexes is inherently Western or is inherently uh, within the very concept of individualism. It is true that individualism abstracts the individual from collectives, abstracts them even from sexual identities. So you can say, yes, that ultimately individualism is responsible for this, but I don't think so, because I think that individualism can be made compatible to some degree, because there are always tensions, but it can be made compatible with other forms of collective identities. For one, I think that Europeans should not worry about whether other people are individualistic or not. That's an issue for them to worry about. And so, in a sense, I think Europeans should preserve their identities, their ethnic and cultural identities, even as they are individualistic. So, in that sense, I see them, ethnic identity and individualism, as being compatible with each other. So, there is that issue that in celebrating so much about the West, I'm also endorsing modernization. And to some degrees, yes, I am, but I believe that many of the things that we think are very negative about the West really came into full fruition after the Second World War. They have roots in the past, but it was really after the Second World War that, in my estimation, we had this degradation of Western values. There were certain people, certain ideologues, who willfully penetrated and corrupted the principle of individualism, of democracy. Um, and this happened for reasons that I get into in my book, Canada in Decay, primarily after the Second World War. So at the same time, I mean, I think that not everything after the Second World War is bad, but I do think that we need to be aware of this ideological corruption and penetration of many Western uh, values and beliefs and tendencies. Some people, in a very conscious way, I mean, I have no doubt that the people who began to push multiculturalism, they used to be, many of them, ex-Marxists, very strong Marxists, communists, and suddenly they realized that doesn't work. It failed. So they decided, and we call it the march through the institutions. They decided consciously to penetrate through every Western institution and to twist the meanings, the words, and turn them in another direction. So, for example, you take the idea that everyone in the West should have individual rights. Well, today, they have extended that to mean that everyone in the world has the same human rights as you do, and that because they have the same human rights, that kind of means they should have the same citizenship rights, and so there should be open borders. Well, I don't think that that's inherent to liberalism as a philosophy that you have to have open borders. People forget that liberalism emerged simultaneously with nationalism in Europe. Even the French Revolution, and I'm not going to get into the French Revolution now, but even the French Revolution that many people really criticize, um, it is not realized that a lot of these, not just the middle classes, but the slightly lower classes in France were very nationalistic. And many of the people that objected to the aristocracy and their privileges, they would say, you know, we are as much Frenchmen as you are. You should not have more privileges than we do. And so they had a patriotic sense that France is ours. And Napoleon exploited this and created these incredible armies by utilizing that nationalistic identity that the French people had. So nationalism also is not inconsistent with liberalism. And recently, in the last few years, a number of books have just come out making that argument that we should not think of nationalism. And here we're talking about a collective identity. We should not think of nationalism as being inconsistent with liberalism. My view is that the two go together. So in that sense, I don't view Western liberalism in a negative way.
You do a great job in your books of a holistic approach to history. And you point out those academics that we were speaking about in the introduction often will specialize and become myopic, thinking that just one certain era or one circumstance in history was the linchpin, the tipping point that gave Europe a quote unquote advantage. And this is very in vogue, very PC right now.
Right.
You do a wonderful job of showing that underneath the different skins of ideologies and historical orders and economic orders and even religions, there is a character trait that you can trace through us. And you do a wonderful job of showing that. The tricky thing is, if this character trait inherent in the character, one of our characteristics is this individualism, how do we respond to the current world we live in, where because of our technology, we are now in touch with and interfacing with all of the rest of the populations of the planet, at least in some way. And so that instinct of openness, now, as you were saying, it gets confused and it gets corrupted, and now this idea of human rights becomes civil rights, and there are people that make these arguments about open borders, which doesn't logically make any sense because you can't have the entire world come to one country. We all know this. But I realize it's no small question, but do you have any thoughts on how to realistically deal with that characteristic if it's in European peoples, in white peoples, confronted with this unnatural circumstance, and maybe the circumstances evolved more quickly than we adapted to it, of this hyper-connected, hyper-technological world we live in?
Yes, that's right. In the book Uniqueness of Western Civilization, one of the things I do is that I say that thus far, academics who are specialized have been attributing Western uniqueness to one major epoch or transformation. So they will say that the rise of modern Newtonian science was responsible for modernity, or is what made the West different, or the Industrial Revolution. That is the predominant view right now, which in a sense takes away Western uniqueness and makes it a temporary thing, because other cultures have adopted, assimilated Western science and have industrialized. So people now say, oh, well, Japan is Western and so on. And to me, that doesn't make sense. So what I argue is that modern science, the Industrial Revolution, are part of an ongoing process that should be traced back to the Europeans. And it doesn't mean that Europeans, from that point in time, which is in prehistorical times, the fourth millennium, it doesn't mean that from that time on, the West was already meant to go where it went later on. But clearly you have to start somewhere, and I start with their aristocratic, individualistic culture. But then come the ancient Greeks, and they make incredible contributions, and you have to bring in here all kinds of factors, the geography of Greece is an important factor, where they are located, the influences of Mesopotamia and Egypt. And then you go to Rome, and then you go to Christian Europe, and through the Middle Ages, we see amazing new developments as well that are very important in creating Western uniqueness. So to me, it is a very long, drawn-out process. And even after the Industrial Revolution, or right around the same time, you have Romanticism, you have the German Idealist Revolution, and then you have the Second Industrial Revolution. So all these things are important. So that's why, in a sense, I feel you can't specialize. You have to look at the whole thing to really understand what the West was all about. But ultimately, I do go back to the Indo-Europeans, and more so recently, I'm emphasizing a lot the evolution of a different psychology. And it is a complicated argument that I have just started investigating. But I will say this also in defense of the idea of individualism. I will say that you really cannot have a growth in knowledge, and you can really not have proper knowledge unless the individual discovers that their mind exists, is a separate faculty, and they neatly separate it from everything else, and they begin to dig into it to their own thinking. It is as if thinking realizes that it itself is the agency of its own thoughts, and that it comes from the mind. And you can see this in the ancient Greeks, whereas you don't see this happening in other civilizations. I have an article on the axial age, and I don't know if we have time to get into this, but I will say that there are inklings that the Chinese, the Israelites, Persians possibly, and maybe the Indians, that they are beginning to understand their place in history, to look forward and backwards and see where they're located historically, and to address their sense of being and existence. But I don't see them in any way reaching the high levels of introspection and awareness that the Greeks, the pre-Socratics, reach. And so when you look at the history of the West and look at the fact that most of the philosophers come from the West, and that most of the knowledge that we have comes from Europeans, and that all the disciplines that have been created were created by Europeans. I mean, we're talking something really major here. You look at geology, botany, zoology, geography, all the disciplines were all created by Europeans. So all knowledge comes from them practically. Well, you have to realize that your very act of thinking today, when Westerners like Alain de Benoist and others think about individualism, they themselves are being very Western. They are drawing from that reality. So you can't say traditionalism and pretend you can unthink, think away what has transpired, because you're caught up with the very achievements of Europeans. And so to me, we are stuck with this. There is no turning back. There is no way that we're going to inhabit a world in which we have traditions that we follow because they were mandated by God. That's why I can't really be a Christian, because ultimately, for me to be a Christian is really, if you really are a Christian, you have to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And you have to believe certain things that, in my view, you accept because you just accept them. And the same thing even with male-female relationships. Europeans expect to be given reasons, and they expect to offer reasons as to why they're going to believe, say, in the traditional family. And we can reach that conclusion. Doesn't mean the traditional family goes. You can reach a very rational, well-articulated set of reasons why that is the best way in which we can organize society. But we're not going to do it in an unthinking, mandated, coercive way. And we have to deal with that reality. You can't tell women anymore that, well, you're going to have to marry when you're 15 and start producing children. That's not going to happen. It's just it's a reality that goes against their own sense of individualism and their own sense of decision making. They have to make that decision.
We're a strong-headed people, as I believe you said in Uniqueness of Western Civilization.
Right. Stubborn. There's a sense of pride, and I mean, you see it even in the dissident right, that there's a lot of debate, a lot of arguments, and that's going to be part of it. Even though I just said before that I cannot be a Christian, at the same time, I don't mind people who really are very Christian who are on our side. I think that's just part of the very real, substantial intellectual diversity that you see in the Western world.
Jason, did we have some housekeeping before I get to the next question?
Yes, absolutely. We have some super chats. Everybody is already excited about the conversation that we are having here today. And I, most of all, am excited. I do have a question myself, too. I do want to give a big thanks to European Housewife, while I have the floor, for all the work that she's been doing over the past few days to collect comments that are positive relative to going free, people whose lives have been changed. I mean, we have some messages that have come in about people who have decided to have children, who did not have children, people who have decided to have more children, who already have some children. It's a wonderful thing. People pulling themselves out of the gutter. This is magnificent. And she is collecting a lot of these comments off of the threads. A big thank you, a round of applause to European Housewife, ladies and gentlemen, if we can get that, because I'm going to be using these personal stories, these anecdotes, with me. I'm going to be having them with me when I have some discussions with some influential people over the next few days, and hopefully bringing in assistance that heretofore we have not seen in the white positive sphere. So very exciting times. Big thank you to European Housewife and the time that she has donated. Now we have a super chat from the great Mrs. Horst, super chatting with $4.99. Thank you very much for that investment in white well-being, my friend. And writing, I am a domestic engineer mother of 9 children. 9 children, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Mrs. Horst, and big thank you to Mr. Horst as well for rearing 9 children. That is splendid. In love, no doubt. These are not just 9 children. Sometimes you see these in religious families, but they're teaching them ultimately to embrace anti-whiteism as an ideology. No doubt that Mrs. Horst and her husband are rearing them in love for our people and history and heritage, and to be great members of our community in the future. And continuing, she writes, I would love to give more and will in the future. Much love. No, you have given more than enough. Rear those young little boys and little girls to be heroes of our people, and you will have done much more than the rest of us. Thank you so much. Zero Schizo with $2 Peruvian Soul, writing, can the doctor speak Spanish, and does he have any thoughts on the Puerto Rico uprising? Ricardo, if you could just maybe briefly speak to that. We have a couple more super chats to answer, and then we'll get back on and then we'll get back on track with the interview.
So I'll answer that question.
Yes, sir. Can you speak Spanish?
I can speak Spanish.
Yeah.
I came to Canada when I was 15 years old, and although I rarely speak Spanish now, my accent, as you can tell, is very strong nevertheless. So that is my mother language. And about what happened in Puerto Rico, I really don't keep up with the news there. In fact, I actually don't keep up with the news in any place other than I watch Tucker Carlson at night. And that's pretty much where I get my news. And I do occasionally check other sites to read the news, but I'm not into daily events. I think they happen fast and they come and go, and a lot is made of them. And I look for the long-term trends.
Indeed, as a man of your caliber would. Thank you for that response. We have a super chat from Snow Duchess. Thank you very much for the super chat. $20. And writing, it is for Tyler Wingate, in memory of Tyler Wingate, the young man who was beaten to death for having a fender bender with an anti-white, non-white, and of course, irrespective of where he was ideologically when this occurred. This is a hush crime which is not being reported to the rest of the world, as it would be if the races were reversed. So thank you very much for that investment in white well-being, Snow Duchess. And we have a super chat from Scott, writing with $5 Canadian. Does Ricardo have any insight into what the Canadian government's rationale was for denying entry to those fleeing Germany ahead of WW2 into Canada? So for those fleeing Germany into Canada, to Canada, ahead of WW2, any brief thoughts on that, Ricardo?
Not on that specific issue. I was surprised when I wrote Canada in Decay, and I was looking at the ethnic demographic history of Canada, that Germans were quite a prominent immigrant group to Canada. Once you take into account the English-speaking immigrants from England and Ireland and Scotland, if I remember, the Germans come afterwards for a certain period in the 1800s. So yeah, it was something that really surprised me. And also that they have always kept a low key, unlike any other ethnic group. I mean, you talk about Irish Canadians, Italian Canadians, you name it. You rarely ever talk about German Canadians.
Mm-hmm. Not surprising. We also have some super chats. And folks, you can, just a reminder, super chat here on YouTube. You can also super chat over on Entropy. And finally, by way of the familiar alternative, which is down in the description, you can rappel down into the description. You'll find it there, as did Seeing Red, who super chatted $10 over on the familiar alternative and writing, "Good day to all my white brothers and sisters. I received my copy of Born Guilty. My, oh my, do I have my work cut out for me." What a massive work it truly is. Thank you, Jason. Now, thank you, Seeing Red. You are a regular contributor to White Wellbeing, and it is a great honor to be on the front lines with you and to have you supporting the work that we are doing here. Shaxor also finding his way down into the familiar alternative and super chatting with $5. Thank you very much. Is this the familiar alternative? Well, yes, it is. You have found the spot. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for the investment in white well-being. And I will just pose a question. Really, we were talking about the explanandum of the rise of consciousness or self-consciousness, the conscious that is conscious of the consciousness. And I wanted to ask Ricardo about polylogism, but racial polylogism. Does that play any part? The different reasoning of the different peoples in this theory. Is this an element of what you are discussing in, for example, your other works, but of course your latest article as well? And then we will hop right back onto track with the interview, sir.
Yes. I hesitate to say that we're talking about different styles of reasoning among the peoples of the earth, because I'm of the view that the turn that the ancient Greeks took is the proper turn to a proper style of reasoning. And the reason for that is that, as I was saying before, you cannot reason properly unless you identify the mind as that which is the agency of reasoning in a conscious way. Otherwise, your whole being is overwhelmed and taken over by bodily impulses. I mean, people in the past did not know that there was a mind located in the brain. They kind of thought maybe it's the heart, and then the heart was commingled with emotions, with passions, and all kinds of appetites, and they couldn't make distinctions. And also, there were all kinds of spirits and gods out there
Hmm.
controlling their lives. And the primitive people of the world would attribute a lot of things that happen to these spirits or people that can know their actions, like through witchcraft. And then even later on, when they ceased to believe in witchcraft, they would attribute it to one god, give it a lot of responsibility rather than to themselves. And then for a long time, even in the West, because this is a long drawn out process, it's not as if the Greeks hit the spot and then from there you basically understand all of this. It takes a long time. But so for a long time throughout the Middle Ages into the modern era, we used to think that that which is the good and the criteria for making decisions is something that lies outside us. It could be a natural law. That is this natural law that you just have to apprehend it and then you know how to think and what to do. And I think it was correct to start realizing that there is no such thing as a natural law out there, but that we ourselves are the ones who create those natural laws. At the same time, that doesn't mean it is purely subjective and arbitrary, and you can create any type, which is where we are today, that you can create any type of natural right. There is a sense in which you are discovering things that are inherent to human beings and to the way the universe has been organized. But it is your mind that is making that decision.
Hmm.
Your mind is the ultimate legislator, and so you have to be aware of that autonomy, that there is nothing in the universe that is higher than the mind. Everything else is lower than the mind, even though the mind, if you look at the world in a materialistic way, seems to be a product, and it is a product. But the mind stands above every other thing, including, let's say, you look at a galaxy, and let's assume that in that galaxy we know there is not a single human being there, then the mind stands above that galaxy in terms of being the one that reflects about it. The galaxy doesn't reflect about what it is, it
Hmm.
just is. So, in that sense, I'm very Hegelian that the mind is the ultimate judge of what is truth.
Very well said. Jared George.
Well, Ricardo, yeah, I'm interested to hear, and maybe we could talk about this off air in email, but there's a book by a gentleman named Stephen Flowers called Northern Dawn, and he makes a great case in it for the older Germanic peoples, and they are outside of the fold of the Greco-Roman thought at this time. He's going back to even as far back as, say, the 400 AD, and then tracing it until the turn of the first millennium, how they valued consciousness and they had conception of rights of individuals, much like we do now. There were antecedents to what became English common law and things like that, and even the later German philosophers. And they're outside of the fold of that Greco-Roman, what's thought of as the rational. So even though they were living in this way that was closer to the land, and some people disparage and think that that's not outside of the fold of the rational thought, I think it still dovetails with your thesis that there is something in the European character, because we do share common ancestors, whether it was those ancient Greeks or the antecedents of the people who went into the more northern part of the European continent, that there is still something there that ties them. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that another time or send you that book, but I just wanted to inject that into the conversation and also use this opportunity to get to our next question, which perfectly follows from what we've been talking about. And that simply is, although like any of these questions, there's a lot to it, what are the particular white people's ways to synthesize freedom, as we've been speaking about, but also duties and responsibilities in society, in the group context?
Well, I'll go back to the statement you made about the Germanic peoples. And yes, you will recall in my book Uniqueness, I do address them and I address their individualism. And I, in fact, argue that as the Roman Empire had reached a state of decadence, and we have, I believe in historical cycles as well. And I try to accommodate the idea of progress with the idea of cycles. That affluence does corrupt the human character. Easygoing life, too many things available. Um, it kind of weakens the human character. And I have an article in which I do argue that we are now going through a downturn, a historical cycle that is a downturn, and that a lot of the decadence that we see in the West cannot be explained in terms of the ideology of cultural Marxism. That ideology, in some ways, is a reflection of this cyclical process in which the people that at one point had to struggle for everything they had subsequently create enough comfort that the next generation can ease off and calm down and in a sense becomes decadent. So I believe in those historical cycles. And so to your other question about how do you accommodate freedom and the issue of duty and responsibility and so on, we have to be aware of those historical cycles. If you go back to early Canadian history or early American history, many of the characters of not long ago, a few decades ago, people in the 1800s, all the way to the generation that went into the Second World War and soon after. And we admire them because they were more responsible, stronger, and so on. Well, it's because they had not yet reached the low point of the historical cycle that we are now in. And a lot of the things that we dislike were bound to happen, regardless of ideology. Of course, with this cultural Marxist ideology, their aim is to alter the West forever in a radical way by diversifying the white race completely and by breaking apart the different identities of the sexes. Um, but so to me, the issue of duty and responsibility is tied in where you are in that cycle. And I do think that human beings, as life gets harder, as they realize that survival is going to take a lot more, and they're going to have to work for what they have, and they're threatened, and they can witness and see the threats around them, they will get stronger. The parents will raise their children with a lot more duties. They're going to say, you got to do this, and you must do that, and you must get up at this time, and this has to be done, and that has to be done. So the child, from very early on in his her life, internalizes these messages, and they too don't just internalize this work ethic and sense of responsibility and sense of the collective simply because they hear them, but they actually internalize them because they have actually woken up early. They have done things that are hard that you don't want to do because by nature human beings are lazy. We don't really want to do much, and you have to be disciplined, and your individualism in and of itself is responsible for the lack of duty and responsibility. It's just the very affluence that we are living in. I mean, you look at white people with their cars and their comforts and traveling around and all kinds of foods, and they were raised in a very easygoing, laid back manner. Well, your Darwinian instincts are all asleep. Uh, as I would tell my students many times, when I look at you, uh, people that mean to really harm you could be sitting around you and you don't even know it. You have no clue about it because all your Darwinian instincts are asleep. You think they're all like what happened to the Germans, bringing all these people in. You have to be completely out of touch with the Darwinian aspect of human existence to think that you're going to bring in so many people from such harsher, tougher, more masculine cultures, and that they're just going to become like you, and they're not going to exploit and take advantage of you. So that's one answer I would give, and there are many other ways to approach the question you asked, but that's one way.
We have a follow-up question that again builds on what we've been talking about. I think it perfectly relates to what we talked about a minute ago with the Germanics, because I found a quote from one of your articles, and I have shared and will continue to share, and our mods in the chat, please share Ricardo's website, the Council for European Canadians, Council of European Canadians. I'll start my question with a quote from one of your articles. You mentioned Hegel a moment ago. So I found this when Hegel writes about a shared conception of the good, when he says that individuals enjoying their negative freedoms in the private sphere can be capable of embracing the social freedom of the state, that is, experience the ends of the state as integral to their own selfhood as modern rational citizens. He does not mean economic goods only. He means as well the cultural collective goods and sense of peoplehood, or Volk. And we went on to say that Hegel said the Germanic spirit is the spirit of freedom, a theme that we're talking about. So I want to focus on this word folk, because Jason and I often discuss that on this show as the missing ingredient, the linchpin that hems people in, that they're not just these random free agents in a society, that the state has to be imbued, pushing political and in cultural ways, implicit and explicit, this message that you are a folk. There is a larger family, in a sense, to the nation of the people. So I'm wondering if we can begin to bring that theme into the fold and mix it with what we've been discussing so far.
Yes, Hegel and other German thinkers were the ones who understood that you cannot have a market individualism on its own to create a cohesive society, that you do need a government, and that the government is in charge or plays a big role in ensuring that the people living in a nation are not just private individuals, private citizens. And Hegel did believe in the notion of privacy. He criticized the ancient Greeks because he argued that they only had a conception of public freedom, not yet a conception of individual rights, and that individuals come in all kinds of forms with very different personalities and traits, and that they should be allowed to express themselves as they see fit through their own decisions. So while Hegel appreciated that, he also felt that a people also has to have a sense of what brings them together as a culture. And that, of course, is its nation state. He was a nationalist, and he had a sense of national identity. So the government, only the government, can be in charge of these collective values and the things that bring a collective identity. Individuals on their own, by themselves, can't do that. So in the past, but this is true even in the United States, even though the Anglo conception gives a lot of weight, more weight, to the individual as the decision maker, there is no question that the state in the United States not long ago would still play a kind of collective role, even if it was because they would put the flag everywhere. I mean, individuals don't do, you can do it in your own homes, and many Americans still do that. But the state is the one that is in charge of that. They were in charge of primary education. Of course, schools are autonomous to some degree, but they play a big role in bringing a certain sense of a collective history. I mean, Americans would go through primary and secondary schools, and they would get a common history. They don't do that anymore. I mean, by the 1970s, history has been, not totally, but has been increasingly replaced by social studies. And today there is barely any history. Before there was a lot of history. So Hegel and the Germans, more so than the Anglo-liberals, emphasize the importance of collective values, and that's why I go to Hegel, and you made reference to an article that I wrote about this, um, and that at the same time, just because Hegel emphasized the collective, it doesn't mean that he didn't understand individual freedoms. He did. So this is something that people have had a lot of difficulty understanding about Hegel. They think he was a totalitarian thinker. Karl Popper was the one who spread this idea in The Open Society and Its Enemies, a book that came out in 1945, I think. He portrayed Hegel as a totalitarian thinker. But now we know that he was not. And there have been many books. The problem with Hegelians today is that they have, that's another topic, but they have transformed Hegel as much as they can into some kind of pro-diversity leftist guy, and he was far from that. He was, by our standards, very conservative. But nevertheless, again, a person that really appreciated the incredible importance of being mature enough, of having citizens in a society that are mature enough that they themselves make the decision as to what government they want, who they elect, and how they think.
If I am seeing what everybody else is seeing, I am seeing a black screen for Ricardo. And if Ricardo, if you can still hear me, then if you could please take a look at your settings and see if you can still see yourself on your computer. If not, then could you please rejoin the chat if you can hear me. Jared, if you could please maybe send Ricardo a message to rejoin the chat. And while we are doing that, ladies and gentlemen, I will talk with all of you about a couple things that I just read. And one of the first things is Shaxor super chatted $104.17, writing good.
Connected for a bit.
Here we go. Okay, we have you back, Ricardo.
We lost you for a bit.
Yeah.
We lost you for about 45 seconds. You're back, though. Please continue what you were saying.
I finished that one. I finished that question.
Okay. All right. Well, then I will continue with the super chats that we have. And whatever it was, I'm sure the anti-whites thought it was very dangerous for the population to hear, so they had to silence you, my friend. But let's get to. I was just saying, Shaxor just super chatted $104.17 by way of the familiar alternative. Thank you very much for the kind super chat and investment in white well-being. And he wrote no more than good. Thank you for being here and your comment. We also had I'm Opa, your Opa, super chatting $4.99. Thoughts on J. Hyde's righteous mind, Mr. or Dr. Duchesne. Rationality is a rider on an elephant, even for Europeans. So religion is more plausible than no? Question mark. So I read it on an upturn because it's a question. Is religion more plausible since, according to perhaps the super chatter, and this is the righteous mind written by Hyde, rationality is a rider on an elephant. Any thoughts on that, Ricardo?
So there thoughts on Jonathan Hyde, right? So I wrote an article about his ideas not long ago. I'm not really in tune with a lot of what he has written, but I have read enough that I felt I could write an article. And what I say is that I really like his findings that when you do cross-cultural studies, you find that human beings more or less believe that there are 5 to 6 essential moral beliefs. Right now, I don't know if I'm going to remember all of them, but there is one, the notion of the sacred, that all human beings have a sense that some things are sacred and you just don't walk over them, a sense of religious respect and so on. There is also the belief that he talks about. One of them includes liberty. There is another one. See, now it's not coming to my mind because there are specific words that he uses. But if you Google this quickly, you get them. Those Haid's 5 moral beliefs. And am I still on here? Because I noticed disappear a bit.
You are still on. Yes, indeed, sir.
And people can see me there.
Yes,
Well,
they can.
can one of you quickly Google Haid's 5 moral beliefs just so we can do it properly? And I'll go quickly over it because this question does address some of the questions you have been asking me.
Yes, we sure can. We'll do that.
And there will come up 5 or 6 key moral beliefs. There's a sense of the sacred, liberty, a sense of fairness. People throughout history believe we must be fair. There is this 4th one is what? Did you get that? I could Google it myself.
I have it pulled up. Yeah. The YouTube was just funny because sometimes it's displaying me or Jason even when you were talking, if you're looking at it live. But that's a minor thing. That's okay. But everyone heard you. You're still here.
Yes.
But I see this as the original theory proposed 5 foundations: care/harm, fairness/cheating, loyalty/betrayal, authority/subversion, and sanctity/degradation. So those were the 5.
Right. So sanctity, that's the idea of sacred. We believe those things are sacred. You should not degrade them. And that could mean, even in the case of a society that's liberal, that the rights of an individual are sacred. Just the basic right to be yourself and not for someone to grab you and forcibly coerce you to do things. But we associate that mainly with religion. The authority subversion. We believe, he says, cross-culturally, that authority is necessary and we will respect authority. So if a judge comes to a decision, we tend to think on average that we will respect that decision and the authority of someone with a degree, a cop who stops you, and so on. Then fairness, cheating, we don't like it if somebody's cheating and it's not fair. And then harm, we don't want people who engage in violence. And then you have loyalty and betrayal. So these are the basic values that he said most people tend to believe across cultures. So what and the next point he makes is that actually conservatives tend to believe in these 5 values equally, more or less. Liberals, however, tend to overvalue care, and care now doesn't just mean do no harm, but means caring for everyone in the world, caring for illegal immigrants more than for your own people, even to that point, because their loyalty is very weak. So in the case of liberals, they go for care and fairness. If you add, sometimes they add 6, and liberty will be one of them. But so liberals tend to go for care and fairness, and they value very little the other 3. Whereas conservatives are more balanced as a people. So this is what he found. So I said, that's a very interesting finding because it shows that conservatives are actually really caring and into fairness. It just so happens that loyalty matters to them as well. So when they say, let's care for the illegal immigrants, they are, yeah, I could care for them, but I'm also loyal to my neighborhood. And if I see my neighborhood being threatened by masses of illegal immigrants, I'm not going to like that. And authority, they do care more for authority and so on. So what I argue about this argument that Hyde makes is that he really doesn't make any distinctions about the fact that in the past, traditional societies, and maybe that's why he dropped liberty, because he used to be there. In the past, traditional societies, they didn't value these things equally. Traditional societies, in many ways, were not as obsessed with fairness as Western peoples became, who became obsessed with fairness at the individual level. So If somebody committed a crime in the West, they would not hold the entire family through generations responsible for that crime. In Europe, increasingly, that was seen as very unfair to the children who are not responsible for this crime or other family members. So it's a complicated argument, but basically, since I was asked about Jonathan Hyde, what I would argue is that we need to westernize these concepts and not believe that all cultures across the board more or less have the same basic values. That's not true. We wouldn't underestimate how different Western peoples are in regards to these values. Even conservatives in our society, when they talk about authority, they mean something different from what a traditionalist in a Muslim country means by it, or what a person in China means by authority. Here,
So,
if the authority is illegal, not elected properly, you are not going to respect it. Whereas in Mexico, even when you have governments that are usually corrupt and some people are a lot more passive about that, they don't question it. So that's the point I make.
so, Ricardo, the questioner, unless you have something, Jason, the questioner clarified something, and we can actually use it to dovetail to another question that we had lined up anyway, if that's all right to get to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the questioner clarified in the chat, what about the rider and the elephant? Man is largely the servant to the passions and predisposed to take culture from authority uncritically. So he is, I believe, saying, and maybe Hyde had made this analogy, that the elephant is the passions and that the rationality is just the rider on it. But this is how I want to fix this with a question that we had, because the question assumes that all people are the same. And again, Ricardo, we know we have to be a little delicate or mindful about how we speak about such things on YouTube, because apparently we can't speak like adults, even though we're theoretically living in Western civilization. But the internet is kind of non-Western, maybe you could say, in a way, some of these internet censorship protocols. Transcendence. We were going to talk about transcendence in our myth and religion versus world-denying retreat that we see in other cultures. So even if the questioner is correct, that I don't think anyone's arguing that man, or even Western man, is only rationality.
Right.
But one could say that agency, and that striving to be recognized and that striving for achievement and individual freedom is a thumatic, or maybe you could even say religious instinct within the Western man. So our need to differentiate, our need to think about thinking, our need for transcending beyond limits is a religious instinct, and there's agency. Dr. Duchesne so well pointed out something that I often speak about, and that is that in the Norse myths and in the Greek myths, you see men who sometimes put themselves on the level of the gods or question the gods, and you don't see evidence of that in other cultures, which speaks volumes. So the questioner again is saying that the rationality is riding on the elephant of irrationality.
Yeah.
One could even say that our irrational nature, our thumatic nature, still is looking for agency, and so we are going to have a different expression of this as Westerners that other people would have.
Okay, so one way in which perhaps I can offer an answer that seems reasonable to this person is to go back to Plato's three parts of the soul. So Plato said that the soul has three parts, or you could say the basic psychology of human beings consists of three parts. At the lower level, the animalistic part, are the appetites. And these are appetites for food, for sleeping, for sex, for satisfying your basic appetites. So that's at the lower level. And when we say lower level, they are very important because we human beings are animalistic creatures. These are appetites are very powerful. We want to eat, and if the food is really good, we like it even more. We are obviously have a very strong sexual drive and so on. So nobody denies that. Then, as you mentioned, you have, properly speaking, the passions, because the appetites are not the passions per se. The passions, Hegel too, but Plato associated the passions with what he calls the thymotic drive. And that has to do with the fact that human beings, particularly males, have a strong sense of pride, a sense that if you walk over them and disrespect them and treat them in a way that belittles them, they can become very angry. I mean, you see this in the Iliad. It's an obsession with it. From the very opening of the Iliad, Achilles is really, really angry because he thinks the ruler disrespected him in the way he appropriated some females that were his. And so this is a thymotic drive. It's the seat of anger. It's also the seat of pride. So then you have reason, and reason is reason. Let's just leave it at that. So what Plato is saying is that, and I think this is in Hegel, and I also argue this, is that among the Europeans, the Simotic drive was very powerful because of their aristocratic sense that they're not going to submit to a ruler who treats them and expects them to kneel in front of him, or just the way Stalin treated the Bolsheviks themselves in a really, he expected slavish characters to be in awe of him. And so these men had lost their sense of pride. The Bolsheviks who actually created the revolution were strong, proudful individuals, but he liquidated them, all of them. So he created these submissive followers that conform to the Eastern pattern of rule. And that pattern of rule has never really worked in the Western world, which is why the Greeks had democratic citizens, and then the Romans had a republican government. It's all about that. These proudful aristocrats who will follow the authority of a legitimate ruler, but are not going to submit to it. So, and this is another point now that a lot of people don't understand, and I myself never have fully understood it. And it is that the fact that you will not allow the appetites to take over your personality is itself a result of your passions, of your sense of pride, because you don't want to allow yourself to be consumed by your appetites, because that's weakness. And people would call it effeminate. The Greeks would refer to the wealthier and now more decadent Persians as being emasculated, because they would sit around with all their harems and sex and a lot of wine and so on, and they're like, that's not for us. Then the Romans would say the same thing about the Greeks. They saw that the Greeks had become weaker, they were not these tough guys, whereas the Romans were very, very disciplined and really farmers who would work from morning until night, and they would also constitute the Republican armies. And this guy had a sense of pride not to let the appetites take over. But eventually, going back to the issue of historical cycles, as Rome becomes really wealthy and all this wealth starts coming in, the appetites take over and their sense of pride declines slightly. So they give into their appetites. So also reason is connected to that, because your decision that you're going to let your reason make the decisions, and that you're going to rely upon it rather than submit to some text blindly because they told you sacred, like the Quran. Like if they tell a Westerner, the Quran is the voice of God and it says this and it says that, a Western person is like to stand back and say, hold on, I can reason myself about these things. So your pride is coming into play as well. So it's not like Hegel thought, oh, well, it'd be great when we become this pure, disinterested rational beings wearing, the white coat that doctors wear to signal that I'm not going to allow my emotions to get in the way. That's not what he's saying. Hegel was of the view that human beings are very passionate and that passions are very good. Otherwise, you're just talking about dead, robotized, rational beings. And that's going to be a big difference with robots. I don't see how you can instill upon robots a sense of pride. And that's really what drives people. I mean, nothing can make you angrier that you feel that something about your ego has been walked upon and violated. But that's happening now when the society gets very affluent, that declines, that thematic pride is softened and the expectations are not as high.
Let me jump in for a brief second here. I'll flip the camera over to me. More troubles with YouTube, not a surprise, and nothing we can't handle over here going free. We have a super chat from I'm Opa, You're Opa at $1.99. Thank you for the kind super chat to the cause of white well-being. The question he has here is thoughts on Richard Spencer. That's a little bit outside of the focus of today's conversation, but if we get through some of the meatier stuff that we have on our plate today, maybe we will give a little bit of time to that question. We also have a suggestion that I thought was worth mentioning, not a super chat, but God's own prototype suggested, Jared, that we have the great Dr. Duchesne and Dr. Edward Dutton on at the same time. Now, that would be a fantastic show. It would have to be at least a 3-hour show, I think, because that would be sterling.
It'll be interesting because, I understand the importance of evolutionary psychology, and he's very good at that.
Yes.
And at the same time, I think there are limitations to what evolutionary psychology can say about European psychology.
Yes, indeed. Well, that would be, Jared, we should really try to set that up. I think that would be maybe a great... we won't give anything away, folks. We'll keep it in surprise. But if we do set that up, it'll be a sterling show, I assure you.
I'd love to.
Yeah.
If Ricardo graces us again at some point, it'd be wonderful.
It would be. The two powerhouses together. Boy, the horsepower there. We have a question that I thought worth answering over on Entropy, ladies and gentlemen. You can ask questions and then vote on those questions on Entropy so that the best questions or most liked questions rise to the top and are the ones that get the first attention from yours truly. And Scooby-Doo has asked this question right out of the cartoon and has written, can you ask Dr. Duchesne if his views on Western consciousness are compatible with the psychological theory of bicameralism? And then we will get back on track with our line of questioning for the great Dr. Duchesne. Please, sir.
Yes, they are. I mean, I read Julian James not long ago. I was aware of his book, and I felt it's a book that I'm going to have to read at some point. And individuals had asked me about it because they felt some of the things I said in Uniqueness reminded them of things that Julian James said. So it was, I think, last spring, not this one, but the one before, that I decided to study his book. And I was really fascinated by the things he says. I have written about it, and there is an article, actually an introduction, that will come out to a translation of the Iliad. It's an old translation that was released in the 1800s, but will be released again by this publisher. And they asked me to write the introduction. So there I got into Julian James. I have some criticisms, but by and large, this idea that he has that human beings were not conscious of their consciousness through history, but that this happened at some point in time, and that before they were conscious, they had like bicameral minds. Their minds were split in such a way that they had, in his view, these gods and these authorities telling them what to do, speaking to them, and they couldn't be self-determining agents in their own right. They couldn't rely on their own capacity for decision making, because they would hear these voices. In a way, he even uses the idea of schizophrenics who have voices on their heads that tell them things. So he says people used to be that way in the past. So I found this quite fascinating because it kind of really brings to light the fact that we shouldn't assume that just because we are evolutionary creatures, speaking of Dutton, just because we go about rationally surviving in our struggle with nature, and we are quite rational doing so in making tools and following animal trails and so on, it doesn't mean that we're the same as hunters and gatherers. Their minds and brains were bicameral. They had these uh, forces, thoughts, dreams in their heads that overwhelmed them and control their thinking processes. And it was a very, very difficult thing for human beings to kind of say, hold on here. I actually can be the agent of my own thoughts. I can be the adjudicator. I don't need to allow spirits and demons out there to be making decisions for me. And likewise, to allow some despot who thinks he's the embodiment of God and so on to be making decisions for me. I'm going to make them myself. So, yeah, I think his book is a very good one to understand uh, Western youth consciousness.
So we can now switch to a topic, another question in this dichotomy series that we're trying to synthesize or get more clarification about. And this is something that just keeps coming up in the shows Jason and I have been doing, particularly this summer over the last several episodes of the After Party. And that is, we've been talking about these twin drives and different dichotomies in the European man. On the one hand, reverence for nature, stewardship for nature. On the other hand, technology, mastering nature, manipulating nature. We've already been speaking a lot about modernity. We began on the topic of modernity and the fact that this desire to form technologies and manipulate nature has led to a lot of the two-edged swords of the modern world. In all of your studies, how do you conceive of this? Where does this twin drive come from? And how do you think that we can get in a better balance of that again today?
Well, I mean, I think we're seeing it already. When you think about it, who drove the ecological movement? It was white people. They are the ones who became concerned with the way in which obsession with mastery over nature could really harm the environment in ways that were just not good. Who came up with the idea of animal rights? Again, it was Europeans. Who created national parks? The idea that there are some lands that are so beautiful that you should just demarcate them and protect them. This started in the United States in the 1800s. Now, to those people who think that traditional societies were in harmony with nature, I mean, they're really just not being realistic. The biggest polluters in the world, India, China, I remember leftists, I was taught that the Chinese, Maoist China, they were really in harmony and they cared for nature because they were not profit oriented like we Westerners, and the Soviets were the same. Well, it turned out that they were the biggest polluters in history. They did incredible harm to nature, and today they're doing a lot of harm. They don't have animal rights in India or in China, only to the extent to which Westerners have taught them about that. Um, they don't have an ecological movement. Pretty much, a lot of them look to the public space as, I'm exaggerating a bit, but they don't mind just releasing a bunch of garbage in the public space because that's not theirs. So in India, you have river after rivers jam packed with plastic bags and bottles, enormous pollution. So to those who think, oh, the West is being so harmful to the environment, and that I said they're just it's a leftist view that the traditionalists have taken. On the one hand, I like the leftists, if you want to call them, who care for the environment. And that doesn't mean global warming, you have to accept it because that's something else. But I like leftists who care for the environment and for animal rights. At the same time, I think traditionalists who talk about this and say this is one of the virtues of traditional culture, I say, no, that's not true. The traditional people really were not ecological in any way. The reason they were in supposed harmony with the environment is because they didn't have any advanced technology. They were overwhelmed by nature. They didn't understand it. Nature controlled them, because if you don't understand nature, you're under nature's control. Now, don't take me wrong. I think ultimately nature is beyond our understanding, in the sense that we can understand a lot about it, but we will never have answers to the ultimate questions as to why there is being as opposed to there being nothing. We don't know those things, and I don't see how we could ever know that. And nature has a dynamic and a way of things that is beyond us. So that's something that I'm going to get into. And I think that citation that you read in the very beginning is going in that direction to understand the archetypes that continue to exist within us. Because even though we overcame a lot of this primitive mindset, there are things about that world of the past, that world of natural man, that Carl Jung refers to as archetypes. They continue to inhabit within us. But I don't know that much about that, and so I'm not going to talk much more about it right now.
Jared, please, if you want to continue. I can't say enough, though, folks, about this article most recently written, and I will drop the link to it in the description by Dr. Ricardo Duchesne. It is magnificent, and take your time as you go through it. Don't rush whatsoever. There's a lot of meaty material there, and it's speaking deliberately and succinctly to the station that we have arrived at as a consequence of this history that is being, as best as anti-whites can, is being erased and being redefined. We talk about this often on the Going Free streams and here on TAP, as well as some of the other shows that the great Jared George and I do, that the anti-whites, to arrive at a conclusion that inflicts harm on Western kind and Western civilization, they will redefine, they will redescribe, they will recategorize. We see this, we just saw this with them, with all of the immigrants coming into the country, sneaking in or coming in illegally. I should say border crossers. I know we have a particular sensitivity to these people now here on YouTube after the ADL has partnered with YouTube. So these border crossers, and we see just the changing of the definitions. And we see now, and what Dr. Duchesne Ricardo has observed in academia is this lifetime of time that he has spent teaching and observing how we went from a solid science and a solid observation based in empirical data and fact, and coming to conclusions that were supportive of Western kind as a central player in all that we call today as Western civilization, obviously. And we talk here, Ricardo, about this as we describe it as a biospirit that is within us. In other words, the Western civilization is in us before it is in the world around us and cannot be perpetuated or created by other peoples. There's no evidence that they've ever done it before. And you write about this beautifully as well. So I did want to mention that before moving on. And I think we have, let me just jump down. Folks, if any of you have tried to super chat on Entropy today and it has failed, tag me in the description and let me know. So if you have tried to super chat over on Entropy and you have not been able to, tag me in the description, let me know. Otherwise, we have a couple super chats here. And you can, of course, super chat on YouTube and by way of the familiar alternative down in the description. Scooby-Doo, we just answered his question that was asked over on Entropy. Super chatting now with $5. Thank you very much. Great show today. Thank you all. Well, thank you for being with us and your kind investment. And the great Syrup moderator doing double duty with £10. Thank you very much, Syrup. and writing, Canada is a vast country, the second biggest in the world, but many of us know little about her culture or customs. Does Canada have unique food? She seems to be a modest nation and never a braggart. Well, that, of course, in Western civilization is a compliment, but we know less, I would imagine, and we'll get Ricardo's opinion on this before moving on with the interview. But I imagine that we know a lot less about Canada in the States, in the UK, and the rest of Europe, Australia. I'm sure they know next to nothing about Canada because we've been told that culture, that strength, that diversity, not by way of our fellow brothers and sisters in another Western country, is enriching for us, is strengthening to us, but in the enrichment and the strength comes only from third world countries and third world peoples, and that is the only diversity there is that can benefit us. And I can attest, I'm sure so many in the chat, if you all want to, please do during this conversation, attest to your time in elementary school, primary school, high school, watching just nature documentaries and television shows. How many times have you seen the focus on Canada? How many times have you seen the focus on New Zealand? How many times, though, have you seen the focus on Africa or some sewer in some other part of the world? We won't say what part that might be, but how many times have you seen that? And in fact, I think we all can say it's just the same as when we see previews for movies or the like, or documentaries for universities. Whenever they talk about the anti-whites and the regime, talk about humanity, we are always shown non-white people running around fires in the middle of the desert, or weaving with baskets. We are rarely shown the great works of the greatest of minds of our people, the people who created the great temples, the great churches, the great bridges, the great works of art and music and science. This we almost never see. And if we were in charge of our own destiny, this would be the wealth of love and encouragement that we would give to our children, and on which they would do greater things. The history of our achievements, they would then know that they can go greater and higher. If our ancestors, if our elders rather went to the moon, they could go to Mars. We would already be there, folks, if we weren't mired in this anti-whiteism. So if let me see. Oh, we also have a super chat from Sean Alexander, $1.99, and he writes, thoughts on Greek Urit and Roman Romanitas. Thoughts on Greek Urit and Roman Romanitas. Do you have any thoughts on that, Ricardo?
Well, I don't quite get the one about the Greeks. Romanitas.
I think he's saying arete.
Oh,
Is it correct?
Yeah, that's the concept of excellence. What I will say quickly about that is that it is interesting that the Greeks invented the Olympics and invented proper competition in sports. It was their invention. And the Greeks, when they went to Egypt, they were surprised that there were no competitions there. You would see the members of the pharaoh family doing certain athletic things, but they did not have competition. So the striving for excellence in physical things is what led to this idea of competition in sports, combined with the fact that individualism is also a form of competition, a sense in which you want to see the individual, whether they're good in this and how good they are compared to someone else. And so it is an amazing thing that people don't realize is that most of the sports that are played today were invented by whites. I know you were talking about the erasing of history. Believe me, all of this nowadays you don't even know this, and you're not even allowed to say it. That article that I wrote on the fact that when you look at sports across the board, whites are the dominant people in most of the sports, cycling, swimming, equestrian and all kinds of mountain climbing and all the risky ventures that they engage in. They're very good, and if you look at the Olympics, they won most of the medals throughout history, and they continue to do. When you look at most of the sports, rather than what Americans do, which is they are focusing on some specific ones to try and make them not aware of it. The strongest man in the world, all white men. So I wrote about this, and the Wise invented all the sports that you see around, almost all of them. I shouldn't say all, but almost all of them. And this is something that you wonder about, and this goes back to the idea of arete. And You were talking before about history. Yes, I mean they are now in a willful, planned out way, and it's been going for a while. But now it's really a concerted effort to erase the history of Europeans as Europeans and to argue that we were diverse from the beginning, that other peoples play a big role in our history. And if they cannot establish that other people play a role one way or the other, because even if they find a few bonds from some African in some English town, they say, oh, Africans were central to the making of this town. But let's say they cannot find those few bonds, they just won't talk about it. And this is happening more and more. Western civilization, by the way, used to be taught across the United States in all colleges not long ago. Today, it's rarely taught anywhere. And those who teach it in such a way that the West is now connected with Mesopotamia and the Near East. That's what they will argue, and Muslims will be given a central role in the making of the West. So yeah, there is a concerted effort to erase the history of whites because you're creating a diverse society and they want everyone to feel part of it. So you just lie and distort history.
Well, that's really, and I'll pass it back really quickly in a moment here to Jared. And that's one of the things that we talk about here with what we refer to as the anti-white narrative. And they apply it, of course, to today and the achievements of the present, contemporary achievements. And clearly they have to apply it to the past. At some point, they have to get around to rewriting all of the past so that it can conform and improve the anti-white narrative today. That's exactly what you're saying. And I want to mention this because this was an article, or this was something that I had read about at some point in the past. And when I was reading your most recent article, Ricardo, this just came back to my memory. And it was a 2,000-year-old computer called the Antikythera mechanism, was found in a Greek shipwreck. And it accurately, perfectly predicts the eclipses. Explorers looked through the wreckage. They found a shoebox-sized contraption covered with dials and filled with about 30 gears made of bronze. The Antikythera mechanism could not only predict the timing of eclipses, but also reveal characteristics of those eclipses, such as the amount of obscuration, angular diameter of the moon, which is the angle covered by the diameter of the full moon, and the position of the moon at the time of the eclipse. The study found, and this is from, ladies and gentlemen, you can go over to livescience.com to find that particular article. There are many on this, and the science researchers were only able to figure out how to operate the device and how the device worked, I believe, 3 years ago. So since its discovery, they've been working on it to try to figure out how it works. These are the people who have given us the genius of Western civilization. They were Western kind. It wasn't a multiracial utopia. It wasn't even a multiracial dystopia. It was Western kind. It was our people. They did everything that the great Dr. Duchesne is talking about today, and a lot more. Who knows how much has been discovered. This is something that probably most of you have never even heard of. And had we not lived under this anti-white tyranny, we all would have heard of this 2,000-year-old computer, ladies and gentlemen, a 2,000-year-old computer. And so I'll pass it back. I don't know if Ricardo has any thoughts on it or if he's heard of the Antikythera mechanism. But if not, we can definitely get back with Jared and continue the discussion.
No, Jared can go on now.
Well, I thank you for sharing that, Jason. It's the first time I've heard of it. Well, perhaps I have, but just forgot what it was called. I mean, we've seen little stories about these things, but that the correct response, if you're healthy out there in the audience, that should move you. You should be moved when you hear things like that. You should be moved with pride, maybe even to tears. Think of where we come from. Think of what our ancestors were doing even back millennia ago. We're told people were just primitive and they didn't know about anything. No, as Dr. Duchesne so well points out, and I sometimes quote him in these shows, we have certain traits. Jason here calls it the biospirit, Ricardo, the biospirit of the peoples of the West that continually manifests itself. It's not just about one little era of history. It's not just about one little economic system or one political order or one ideology. It's a character trait. It's a spirit. It's us. And that's what we're celebrating here and reviving. On that note, we wanted to talk about, and I know we've danced around this tonight, but really focus again on another dichotomy that comes up a lot, the openness and empathy we have versus the striving and the achievement. How do you think that got out of balance? I know you were talking about academia and the Marxists manipulating it before. Obviously, our balance is way over to the empathy, openness side in a general scale right now. How did this form? How did it get out of balance? And again, if you could mix that with a sense of the folk, and I'm even curious, you were talking a little about government's roles and making sure that they continue the education or certain patriotic elements if the government were healthy and of the people. But what about culturally? And how do you think this can continue? How did, Ricardo, did you discover all of this and come to an appreciation of your own heritage? You're an academic, so was it purely from your studies, or were there certain experiences you had, or certain ways that certain things you do now, or things you want to pass on to your family that is more, maybe not from so studious a view, but more from an experiential view? What does it mean to be a white man to you of European descent?
Well, I mean, I grew up in Puerto Rico, and they are like here, although it is coming, they are not obsessed about race. So you can see, for example, a white family, and then you see more dark or black family or black individuals, and they can interact well with each other and yet keep separate, going about their own lives. Like today in the West, there is pressure even on white families to be careful with how many white children they have. It's almost as if you have one, two, that's fine, children. But if you have three, four, and people see that they're all white, they say there's something wrong with it. It's too white. That's the insanity where we are at now. I don't think it's accidental that this royal family just said they're going to have only two children, and they mentioned the environment. That's not the only reason. It's maybe the first child came too white because she's still kind of very light black. But anyway, I won't get into that right now. But in Puerto Rico, they don't talk about that much. And so you watch television, a lot of the actresses are white, and nobody will comment on it. They take it, well, they're just better on TV. They just look better, and they leave it at that. The same is true in Mexico. Although, again, all these other ideas are arriving there. So when I was growing in this environment, you didn't think about it, even though you are aware of it. And I think in my case, and I'm heavily European. I mean, I don't know how true these genetic ancestry studies are, but I am majority like English, Northern France into England, Ireland. A lot of my genes are located there, which is not surprising because my mother is from Britain. My father met her in Paris when he was studying there. And then from my father's side, you have Duchesne, which is I just find out that I'm 15% French, but he also has Portuguese. And I also do have some non-white blood in my case, but I would say something like 90% European. So I think when I was young and I do look white, so I was told that many times. So even though I was saying we don't talk about race, at the same time, you can say to someone, "Oh, you're white or you're not," and it's no big deal. So I was told many times when I was growing up that you're very white, and my hair used to be blondish. So I think maybe that play a role, but I think it's also in your instincts, in it's there, that memory is still there. And so when I started studying history, I was immediately fascinated by European history. I did not go to study history saying, "Oh, I just want to know European history." I didn't know any better. I studied African, Latin American, many other histories. But the European history fascinated me because there was a pattern, there was a rationale. You had the Renaissance, then the Reformation, then the discovery of the world, then the rise of capitalism, then the formation of nation states. So I go, wow, this is like, you see this clearly demarcated epochs, and you can make sense of life. And I wanted to make sense of life, find meaning in things. And when I studied Mexican history, I didn't find much meaning. It was just chaos, one strong man after another taking power, a lot of violence. The same thing in Africa. So unless Western influences come in, you don't see that much development. You don't see too much intellectual life. So I think I began to identify with that history and to believe that the meaning was there. I tell my students and I tell people, if you want to learn, just study Western civilization. You're going to learn a lot less if you study Egyptian history. It's not that you will not learn. And by the way, whites are the ones who wrote the history of all these peoples. They invented archaeology, anthropology, and prehistory and ancient history and the divisions of history into epochs. They invented all of that. And so, but anyways, I don't think you will learn, and I have no doubt about this, that much as compared to Western civilization. If you study Aztec civilization, you're just not going to learn as much. Why? Because they don't have great political theories, great philosophers, no great literature, no that many identifiable great individuals, writings, books, formation of nation states, and the epochs I just talked about. So this is just the way it is. And I think I started identifying with that. And I began to read the histories of mathematics, for example. And I wasn't even thinking about West or white or anything. I was just curious. So, what is the history of mathematics all about? And what is the history of science all about? And the history of art? And as I think back, I realized that that influenced me a lot because I did what when I dropped out of university for a time. Um, and that stood in my mind that actually only the West really has a history of art because it changes and you have many currents. Only the West has a history of mathematics. Egypt has a bit of mathematics, then no history of mathematics because there are no new developments. You have to have something new. You have to have development. What the Alan de Benoist and the traditionalists sometimes criticize is you need it. Otherwise, you don't have a history. The people from India had a very low level of historical consciousness because they did not change that much. They had people coming from the outside and changing things, and that gave them a sense of history. But it's not that sense of history that Europeans had to the point that from ancient Greek times, Herodotus and Thucydides and then others are actually writing proper histories. And they say, we want to be accurate. Um, and then they fully develop the, 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 the field of history and scholarly in a scholarly way. Um, so this is something that I identify with early on.
One of the things that I got from you early on from your books is that our sense of dynamism and that sense of change, you talk about this in Faustian Man in a Multicultural Age, the fact that we are hard to pin down, whether it's philosophically or even geographically because of spreading out and exploring, is itself one of our defining traits.
Yes.
So it's paradoxical on a surface level until you make people see this. And that's the kind of thing that's being exploited. And just as we wrap up, I know I kind of asked two questions. So you answered the second part of it, but I began with the openness and the striving. Anything you could say to close out about better balancing that, because that empathetic nature of ours has been so subverted in recent times.
Yes, they are exploiting it. I mean, there is no question about it. For a long time, wherever you go, they will have pictures of starving Africans or something, and they will hammer those images on you continuously. In itself, is an expression of the fact that whites develop a higher sense of empathy because of their own individualism. They're able to see the individual itself as a real being and not just some member of a collectivity that that particular person is overshadowed and not significant. We think everyone is significant, so we relate to that. But they have exploited that, and we are now at a point, and we need to understand this. The left, and we keep saying that, the left, they are too caring, and that thing from Hyde says care, and it's very high among liberals. But not really. I mean, when you see people like Omar, they are very much exploiting this. That Somali politician in the United States. So Omar is not talking about any of these things when she's in Somalia. Nobody's talking about these things. Suddenly she arrives in the United States and she would have us believe she cares more for the American ideals than whites do. She even says we want to perfect the United States. So they appropriate these ideals to advance their own ethnic interests. I don't think she has any more caring than whites. She, in a very conscious way, is exploiting them to advance their own ethnic interests. Now, in the case of whites, you could say, well, they're not doing it in that way. Well, they too, I am afraid, are now reaching a point at which they're very aggressive. They suppress freedom of expression. They don't give a damn if somebody's fired from their job and they lose income. They have reached a point that is very similar to the communists in the Soviet Union. They'll send you to the gulag because they think you're evil and they're good. And that in itself is not a form of empathy because they have no empathy for that which they have identified as evil. So I think we have to stop thinking that they're more caring. And I think Hyde is wrong in that respect. He keeps acting as if, they're more caring, and he sort of plays that role as well. He talks like he cares for everybody. So it's not true. I think we are more caring. We care for our history, our heritage, for the truth, which is very important. So we have to turn that around.
Amen to that. Very well said. I'm afraid you are now adopted into the community for white well-being, my good friend. We have so many people here that are loving every word you were saying. I ran a poll on Entropy asking whether or not people would like to see you back. Overwhelmingly want to see you return. We have a great question we'll have to come back with, and we'll leave everybody on the hook for this. Ricardo is not going to answer it today, but perhaps next time. It's a great question. It's from El Ronder. And writing, I remember that one of Jared Taylor's conferences, one speaker talked about the IQ of ancient Greeks must have been in the range of 115, 120. Would you say this is likely? And why are we now at 100? Well, Ricardo will keep that a secret. It's called cut and thrust when it comes to marketing, ladies and gentlemen.
Maybe when we have Dutton back on,
right,
Dutton on with him, we'll talk about that.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So this has been an absolutely fantastic discussion. I am very proud of the community and the great support they're giving Dr. Duchesne here. We will start with you, sir. Where can people find you? We have some of your links in the chat already, but where can they find you? What are you working on next? And can they contribute to you financially, your work, and anything else you would like to add in your closing remarks?
Well, they can check the Council of European Canadians. I post articles there, and other people do as well. and they can check my books. And if they are in Canada and they're Canadians, I would encourage them to purchase Canada in Decay. It has been a bestseller at Amazon since it was released, and this really angers a lot of people. And there are insiders in Amazon who do all kinds of things not to let it show up too much in various ways. And so I really think that the fact that this book has been a bestseller is quite significant, because in many ways, in fact, it is the only book that addresses the issue of diversification and how harmful it is in a serious way, and that understands that Euro Canadians have to express their viewpoint from a sense of having an identity. Because if they talk as if they're universal beings, we're all in this together, I can understand, because I am of the view that some non-whites can be part of Canada. I don't have a problem with that, but that doesn't preclude the fact that Euro Canadians have to speak from a sense of identity, because otherwise they're going to lose it and people will disrespect them even more.
Yeah. What else? Any other thoughts that you would like to add?
It was great talking to you guys, and yes, I like the fact that you came out with serious questions, and it's not all about day-to-day politics and that kind of thing. Because this is what I do. Most of my work is really intellectual, and as I said before, I'm not the kind of person who reads newspapers. I don't even read newspapers. um, I like the deeper things. And I don't mind others do, but they need to do it. But anyways, it was great talking to you guys, and I do hope I'm back. And yes.
Oh, that's great. That is fantastic news to hear that you want to come back. I'd really like to have you back for your follow-up article on the one at the end here that I read at the very beginning of the show, because I think that is going to be absolutely magnificent, a scorching topic, a lot of hot takes from there. I get the image, the visual image as I was reading it. This dichotomy that you draw between this, it's almost like this pre masculinity, this masculinization process that you talk about.
Yeah.
It's sort of like this painting perhaps of the woods, and it's turbid as it could possibly be, and there are blurry little fairies dancing through it, and then the next day there is this pellucid, sharp, heroic man standing within it, that the world has been completely transformed by this.
I will have an article shortly about Camille Paglia, in which I will elaborate through what she says a bit more what I mean about this masculinization process, and that before the ancient Greeks discovered the mind, other cultures go through that as well. And it is the beginning of ego consciousness, that we have an ego. It's not a rational consciousness, but it's just a sense that men, when they separate themselves from the great mother, they begin to attain a sense of themselves as identifiable beings that can take charge of their lives and make decisions rather than be overwhelmed by nature and so on. Yeah.
Very well said, and I cannot wait to see that article. Mr. Jared George, our resident brain on tap, our big brain on tap here. He has, and a big thank you, everybody. If we could get a big round of applause, because it was the great Jared George who organized this and brought us the brilliant Dr. Duchesne today, and I'm sure will bring us many more delights in the future. So if we could get a big round of applause for Jared George before he tells us where folks can find him and what he's working on next, because there is a lot of exciting things that Jared is going to be doing, a lot of exciting things that Jared and I are going to be doing together. Things are happening that are in the works. You all will be very happy with. And before I just pass it to Jared for those thoughts, we did just have a super chat come in by way of entropy by My Thark, super chatting $25 Canadian. Thank you, good sir, for that investment in white well-being. There are, he writes, 100 libraries in this Canadian city, and not a single one has a copy of Dr. Duchesne's books. Is that a coincidence? No. These anti-whites know exactly what they dare not put on the shelves. Amen. Proper use of the lexicon here for Going Free. Thank you very much for that contribution. And now I pass it over to my colleague, Jared George.
Well, I'm no more of a brain than Jason, of course. We are a team here, and it's a great thing to do this and to speak to wonderful guests like Dr. Duchesne. I await your article as well. My mind looks for the balance of this because the rationalizing solar god, I see that and it resonates with me. But I am a romantic. I'm a poet. I understand the fairy thing as well. I think we need the sun and the moon. So hopefully it's against a backdrop of the Mother Earth, but not leaving Mother Earth, because as we were speaking about tonight, we need the balance and the harmony in all of these things. But that is just my take on it. And I guess we'll have to leave you with a cliffhanger. We'll see what Dr. Duchesne produces, and we'll all have our own interpretations of that. But very interesting stuff. I look forward to the new book on consciousness, the development of consciousness. We didn't get to speak too much about that, but maybe that's good. We can focus on it at another time. Certainly, we'd love to speak to you when that book comes out, and perhaps at other junctures as well. I've been focusing in the chat tonight, the little bit I was there, because I need to stay focused, especially with a big brain guest like Ricardo. But I'm telling people, Jason and I both really welcome you all to do clips. I'm trying to do that a little bit more. I'm going to try to do that again on my new channel, to take clips. It could be 2 minutes, between 2 and 10 minutes roughly from these shows, because we need to have these meaty conversations. But to get more people interested, or to just reacquaint you with some of the things, give a little digest, people really are asking for these 2 to 10 minute clips. So I shared the link to my BitChute playlist, and I just did my first clip for my new YouTube channel today. Dr. Duchesne, I don't know if you know, but I had an original YouTube channel that was killed by YouTube unceremoniously back on June 5th in a great wave of censorship and deplatforming for hate speech. So I have this new YouTube channel, and I put a link, as I said, to the playlist where I will be putting some clips. The first clip was from a couple of weeks ago when we welcomed John Bruce Leonard of Arctos, and Arctos publishes Dr. Duchesne.
All right, yes.
I don't know if you knew, but we spoke to John Bruce Leonard a couple of weeks ago on this very show, and we will be speaking to him on his own show, Interregnum, very soon. So stay tuned for that. Jason and I will both be his guests. We're delighted to have been invited. So other than that, please do visit thegreatorder.com, my website. As I always tell people, that's the best way to keep abreast of everything that I am doing. Certainly more fun announcements will be coming. Also, I'll quickly mention the Porridge, lovely Porridge from Australia. He and I started this nationalist video competition. So please check our social media for more on that. The deadline is October 15th, but it's a very interesting competition that Porridge envisioned, and I have now partnered with him to make this a reality. Lots of things going on. Too much to list all. That's just a couple. But we are working every day for this. We're delighted to be doing this. We're delighted to be part of this community. It means the world. And we'll just keep putting one foot in front of the other. What can I say? It's been quite a ride, and I have a feeling it's just getting started. But again, Ricardo, thank you so much. It's been wonderful speaking to you. Something I've been looking forward to for a long time. Again, your work has meant a lot to me, and is one of the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing. So thank you. I wanted to personally say that. With that, Jason, I'll give it to you to take us out.
Well, I thank you, good sir, for that. And again, a big thank you to Dr. Duchesne, who will join our family now, whether he likes it or not. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us, and we're absolutely going to have you back. Hey, I want to acknowledge a couple people I saw in the chat today. I saw Jay Hart in the chat. I saw Rick was also in the chat. Eminent Rain was in the chat today, the live chat, and I will add to his name, Non-Perel. Northwest Hearth was in the chat. That's a great name. We had Gov Hater in the chat as well here today. Our redoubtable and esteemed moderators were Syrup, Phoenix Fire, Seaver Hamlin. Did I miss anybody, Jared? I think that was everybody as far as our moderators are concerned. It was an absolutely scintillating discussion. We will have some more. We really got the tap wide open today. Next time I talk with you, ladies and gentlemen, will be on Sunday evening. I will be just flying back. Wish me all the luck you can. I will be speaking with some individuals we'll be having some discussions, causal discussions that could help things to move along much more quickly for us in the work we are doing here for white well-being. Wish me luck. I will see you then, and we will all see you here again on tap next time.